Thank you for watching the Housing Oregon YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe. Slide decks from the presenters are going to be available below. Thanks for watching.
I never know quite how close to put the microphone to my mouth, so perfect. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Savannah. I am with the Fair Housing Council, and the title of the presentation and the description of the presentation in the booklet is going to be a little bit different than our final presentation. We had to make some adjustments as we learned more and kind of put this presentation together. We wanted to make sure we did a very good job of expressing the actual information, the needs, and the history of the Oregon tribes so that we could present it to everybody today in a concise way and include all of the relevant, important information about tribes. So my name is Savannah Meekins. I'm the North and Central Coast Regional Coordinator for FHCO. And I have my lovely coworker here, Jamie Gateway. She is the Education Outreach Assistant Director. She is wonderful. And I'm going to start off with doing a land acknowledgement. So a land acknowledgement in this sense is going to be, I'm just going to give a quick explanation, and then we're going to go into a little bit talking about our content, and then I'm going to switch up, and we are going to get this presentation started. So, acknowledging the land. I would like to thank everyone for joining us as we're gathered here today. We are now sitting, and joining in this conference on the lands of the Noma, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalipia, and the Malaya tribes. There are many other tribes who also called this region and the regions surrounding it home for hundreds and thousands of years along the life-giving waters of the Columbia River. As a member of the Cowlitz tribe myself, I'm a direct descendant of the great Chief Skanora, a Cowlitz chieftain who married his own daughter to a fur trader from the Hudson's Bay Company and created the first white ancestral line of the Cowlitz tribe. I have a very special connection to this presentation and the information herein. It is not uncommon to see white natives in the Pacific Northwest, as many of the tribes interacted with the French Canadian settlers long before Americans moved their way this way. Today, I recognize and feel a very deep connection with the land, the people, and the thriving native communities. I grew up just north of here in Toledo, Washington, on the I-5 corridor in a very, very small town of around 700 people now, about 500 when I was growing up. I spent most of my childhood in the woods learning about the plants, the native species, the animals, the water, and everything that our earth provides to us and what they give to us. The medicine that is provided from our earth that creates the ability for us to thrive. And today that is still reflected in the communities that endure despite the long-standing history of oppression and genocide. We honor the Indigenous peoples of the past, present, and future as we hope that the communities will continue to thrive. Today, I ask that as you attend this session, keep your heart and your mind open. Do not think of sadness or hate, but instead think of hope for the future. And we thank you for being here today. Also, this presentation is going to do a quick content warning. Some of the content in our presentation does include discussions and topics related to Native American history, which includes genocide, forced relocation, and other very sensitive subjects of information. We recognize that these subjects are very difficult for some to hear, but they are essential to understanding the historical context of where we are today. So we encourage everyone to engage with the content respectfully. If you need to step out, please do so. And please remember the experiences of the Oregon tribes as we in the housing industry engage forward in assisting with inclusion, and the expansion of housing as it relates to the state of Oregon and Indigenous peoples. And our intent is to present this information with facts that reflect with positive spirit for the future. Thank you. I'm going to switch off. Thanks. All right. Thanks everyone for hanging in there to the end of the conference. For some of you who are here at the last presentation, the first part might be a little bit of a repeat because we do go over fair housing basics for folks who were not here during the first presentation. So bear with us. Here is a little bit about what we're going to talk about. Our topics that we're going to cover. We're going to talk about fair housing protected classes, where fair housing law applies. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the colonization of Oregon and how that impacted the Indigenous peoples who have lived here for a millennium. And we're going to talk about unique challenges and benefits for Native American tribes, tribal funding for housing, and fair housing application to tribal housing. So those are the topics we're going to cover. And let's just hop right into it. Also, I will say that questions are probably going to pop up. We're going to have a time at the end of the presentation for questions. So if we might just answer them as we continue on, but know that you'll have time at the end and we'll unpack some of those questions. All right, so the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, who are we? Where do we come from? We are the civil rights organization. We're statewide. We have an education and outreach department, and we have an enforcement department. What we do is we proactively promote housing justice, equity, and inclusion. So we get to go all over the state, virtually and in person, and present fair housing information so people know about their rights in housing and rental housing when they're shopping for housing. All of those realms. And then our enforcement department, what they do is they advocate for people who are experiencing discrimination in housing based on their identity. We'll talk a little bit about, I don't know if I actually have a slide on it, but what I will say is if you know someone, if you yourself, if you need to report housing discrimination for yourself or someone you know, you can go to fhco.org. There's a pink button at the top of every page that you can click on. It'll open up our form, and that's how you can reach our enforcement department, let them know what's going on, and they'll get back to you to talk about advocacy and next steps, ways to help. So what is the Fair Housing Act? The Fair Housing Act is a set of civil rights laws that promote equal access to housing. They make it illegal for landlords and housing providers to discriminate against people based on their protected class. And we'll go over who those folks are in a minute. It's important to note that sometimes when I do these presentations, that kind of makes it sound like a cure-all, like we have these laws and everyone's protected, which is true, but discrimination still happens all the time. That's why we're here. So I don't want to just like kind of gloss over it like, no, there's laws and discrimination doesn't happen, because it does, happens all the time. And that's why we're really glad to be here with you all today to talk about these laws and the protections and how to get in touch with enforcement of those laws. So what is fair housing? Fair housing is the right of all people to be free from illegal discrimination in the rental, sale, or finance of housing. So it covers that whole gambit. And housing discrimination is treating a person differently in any housing transaction because of their protected class. So who are, I keep saying that, protected class, who are they? There's a couple different sets of protected classes. Let's talk about the federal protected classes. So anywhere you go in the country, these protections exist. The first four that were added during the civil rights movement were race, color, national origin, and religion. So these were the first four groups that were included. But the law evolved over time. So it went on to add sex during the women's rights movement in the 70s. And now, under the protected class of sex, we also have victims of domestic violence or survivors. Sexual orientation and gender identity also are protected federally. Then in the 80s, we had familial status. So that means families or anyone raising kids under the age of 18. It was mentioned in our last presentation. I think it's something I think about too, because I remember when housing advertising could say no pets, no kids. This was before this group was added as a protected class. And in Oregon, that meant that almost 70% of the housing market was blocked to family. And that's just one story about one protected class. There are lots of stories about all the protected classes that exist. So just one more reason why we're glad that these protections are here. And then also disability was added in the 80s as well. That was, the movement that began disability being added as a protected class was the independent living movement, and it started way before the 80s. It took a long time to gain traction, but when folks were leaving congregate settings and institutions, many of which had a lot of malpractices and horrible treatment of people who have disabilities, they were leaving those places to live independently in the community, and what they found was discrimination was a huge barrier. So that's when, time with a lot of work and advocacy, disability was finally added in the 80s as a protection. And then some states go on to add additional protections. So some states have none. Oregon has a few. We include marital status, which means it doesn't matter if you're single, married, divorced, widowed. Transaction, like all the protected classes. If you have the money to pay for the housing, if you meet the criteria, you should really be able to rent there. So marital status is protected in Oregon. Also, source of income is protected in Oregon. That's like using a housing choice voucher, also known as a Section 8 voucher. Other agency rent payments, temporary assistance for needy families, Social Security, Social Security, disability income, or insurance, they should all be included as money that is income to qualify for rent, if you make enough to rent. Sexual orientation and gender identity are also on here. Again, Oregon added them before the federal government did. So they're on here. It's also important to note that Oregon goes on to protect all of the same protected classes as the federal government does. So there's some loopholes in other states that don't do that. Like some folks will say, oh no, if you have less than 4 units, these laws don't apply. But actually in Oregon, it doesn't matter how many units there are, because Oregon also protects all the other protected classes. So even if it's just one house somebody's renting, this law applies, these laws. And then cities and counties also add additional protections. So depending on where you live, there might be more protections. Like, for example, some cities that have colleges will go on to add age over 18 as a protection. And they do that because some housing providers will say you must be 22 and up to rent, or you must be 22 and up to rent here, which means that students don't have housing choice in the city. So some cities will say, oh, no, we're going to add that as a protection. They should have housing choice too. So where do fair housing laws apply? We're going to go into this a little bit, and Savannah will go into more detail about how it applies to tribal housing as well. But in general, it can apply to apartments regardless of the number of units, houses, or condos, mobile homes, floating homes, senior living communities, and other kinds of senior housing communities. Sometimes shelters, if folks are staying there for an extended period of time, usually they're covered. If they're receiving federal funding, they're covered under the Fair Housing Act. Motels and hotels. This is one that's kind of surprising to some folks. If people are staying there for an extended period of time, it starts to cross over to fair housing. This happens a lot, like when there's disasters like fires, like the one in Southern Oregon where I live right now, the Alameda fire happened years ago, and there's still people living in hotels now. So if they're there for an extended period of time, often fair housing law starts to apply. There's a little nuance there, but if you have questions and you're like, does it apply? We might be able to help out with that if you want to contact us to get some more info. And then what about tribal housing? It depends on where it's located. So I'm going to leave that a little ambiguous because, like I said, Savannah's going to go into detail on that in just a moment. So who has to comply in general with fair housing law? The short answer is pretty much everyone who touches the housing market. So it could be people who own the housing, landlords, property managers, maintenance staff, homeowners associations. They make a lot of rules about who can live there and how they're applying policies, rules, and procedures. Some shelters, residential programs, like I said, possibly those hotels, vacation rentals, they're hosting long-term stays, real estate agents, mortgage lenders, and financial institutions. Jurisdictions, so cities do have some responsibilities, and counties around fair housing. They shouldn't be limiting housing choice or segregating people based on their protected class. Advertising media, this one, a lot of people are like, why is this on here? It's because it can be discriminatory. Advertising can be. Like in Oregon, for example, no Section 8. That would be discriminatory. One that we've heard is active and healthy seniors wanted. That can really create a chilling effect, make it feel like you're not welcome there. So those are just some examples. Insurance companies follow fair housing rules, and then sometimes neighbors as well. And this one's a little nuanced. It has more to do with if somebody's renting and there's two people renting in the same property, they have the same housing provider or landlord, and one of those tenants is harassing the other tenant based on their protected class identity. It's the responsibility of the housing provider to stop that harassment. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the history and kind of ground this presentation in the past, and then Savannah will take us into the present. So we're going to touch on a deeply significant chapter in the history of the Northwest, the colonization of this land and its impact on the indigenous tribes who have called it home for millennia. I have to point out first, though, that this is just a piece of the history. Thousands of people were profoundly affected. Each has their own story and struggle of survival and strengths, and every tribe and band faced unique challenges. And yet, in the face of that adversity, they responded with, again, strength and resilience, and many continue to fight for their rights and their land today. Oregon's indigenous people have always been strong, and their resilience is woven into the very fabric of the land from the beginning of time. So, history books typically introduce the Pacific Northwest and Oregon as the Wild West, a mythical and unoccupied landscape ripe with gold and the potential for farming and industry. But this framing is utterly inaccurate and grossly misleading. In the words of Don Ivy, the former chief of the Coquel Indian tribe, the Coquel have been here since time began. We have been here since the first human got here. Before Oregon was occupied by settlers, it had been home to dozens of indigenous tribes and bands for over, again, a millennium. The bands were culturally and linguistically diverse. Their ways of life complemented the environments where they lived. Some of them traveled following the harvest and migration patterns. Others settled near the coast and waterways to fish and hunt. And as white settlers moved to Oregon, government officials systematically displaced indigenous tribes to free up land. Tribes were forcibly relocated to reservations. The first instance of this in Oregon was in 1857 when the Rogue River and Shasta tribes were forced to march from a temporary reservation in southern Oregon to the Grand Ronde Reservation. This event is known as the Trail of Tears in Oregon. The march took 33 days and a lot of people died along the way. In the beginning years of Oregon's government, the federal government was required to enter into treaties with local tribes before settlers could claim any native land. But just 2 years after that, when Oregon became a U.S. territory, the 1850 Donation Land Claim Act changed everything. All right, skipping ahead. Skipping pretty far ahead. There we go. The act allowed settlers to claim land without any Oregon tribes ceding the land through negotiation settlements. The law said that 320-acre land claims could be granted to each white male who resided in the territory prior to December 1st, 1850, and twice as much if they were married. And then Between 1850 and 1855, white men could receive 160-acre land plots and twice as much if they were married. So the idea behind the Donation Land Act was to provide incentives for white families to move to Oregon, spread out across the state, establish an agricultural economy, and as the population grew, to push indigenous tribes out of the land who had already lived there. And within 5 years, in 1855, Oregon settler population boomed from 13,000 to 52,000. And then Oregon could effectively ignore legal precedents and dismiss tribal sovereignty. So between 1778 and 1871, 400 treaties were negotiated between the United States governments and indigenous tribes, but most of them were never ratified. Once they're ratified, it has the same legal status as the Constitution itself and can't be superseded by normal legislation. So what that means is that the Donation Land Act, or at least the parts that violate treaties, should have been declared unconstitutional, but they weren't. And as a result, millions of acres of native land were ceded in exchange for an estimated mere 3 cents per acre. Following the forcible relocation of tribes to reservations, the government rolled out a new strategy of assimilation and genocide known as the Indian Residential Boarding School Era, which began in 1879 and lasted for almost 100 years. By 1885, Oregon had its own school for Native children, Chemawa. Today, it's known as the longest continuously operated and federally run Indian boarding school in the country. It's one of 4 that are left. It was originally created to forcibly remove Native children from their communities and cut off cultural connection, but it's now under Native leadership and is known for its commitment to building cultural pride among its students. However, it does continue to wrestle with its complicated history as more information about the abuse that occurred there is revealed by survivors and research into archives. So they're learning more all the time about what actually happened there. In 1885, the Dawes Act was passed, which allowed the federal government to break up reservation land and give away individual plots to Native Americans to farm like white homesteaders. The goal was to effectively assimilate them into mainstream culture. Before the Dawes Act, tribes controlled about 150 million acres of land, but after, most of the land had been distributed to individuals and any unclaimed land was declared as surplus and sold off to non-native settlers. So we see through these practices how federal and state laws and policies were used to justify violence, disrupt communities and indigenous power, and perpetuate forceful displacement in order to occupy and steal land. The Oregon Indian Termination Act of 1954 was part of a broader federal policy known as the Termination Act that aimed to assimilate Native Americans into mainstream American society by terminating the recognition of many tribes as sovereign entities. The act ended federal recognition of several tribes in Oregon, including the Klamath, Grand Ronde, Lower Umpqua, Coos, Siuslaw, and Siletz. Once again, tribal lands held in trust by the federal government were divided up and either sold or distributed to individual tribal members as private property. This process resulted in the loss of large amounts of tribal land, as many Native Americans were forced to sell their land due to financial pressures by those who wanted it for themselves. Timber, water rights, oil, and other natural resources were valuable, and they made Indian property holders vulnerable to opportunists. And these photos are of the Klamath tribe who were targeted by the government because they held rich timberlands and water rights. Once a tribe was terminated, its members were no longer eligible for federal services provided to recognized tribes like healthcare, education, and housing assistance. Then the Oregon Indian Restoration Acts of 1983 and 1984 happened, and they were considered landmark pieces of legislation that aimed to reverse the harmful effects of the termination policies by restoring federal recognition to certain Oregon tribes. Their successful passage took years of effort and persistent advocacy by the tribes that were affected by those earlier termination policies. Some of the key advocates were the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde community of Oregon, the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians, and the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians. The acts were seen as a major victory for Native American rights and sovereignty, allowing some of the affected tribes to reclaim their status as federally recognized sovereign nations and begin rebuilding their communities. And this is a photo of the Grand Ronde restoration hearing in 1983. But the acts did face challenges, and there were issues that really stemmed from that lasting impact of the termination era. The years of termination had disrupted cultural practices, languages, and traditions, especially for people who had been separated from their communities during that termination period. The lands returned to the tribes were only a fraction of the original territories they had lost. Even with the restoration of some lands, many tribes did not regain access to the natural resources like fisheries and timberlands and many others that had been vital to their traditional economies and cultural practices. And the federal government provided some funding to support the restoration process, but it wasn't enough to rebuild economies, healthcare, education, other essential services. Restored tribes faced significant economic disadvantages due to decades of disinvestment. The process for deciding which tribes would be restored was not transparent or consistent, and the Restoration Act did not apply to all tribes that had been terminated under the 1954 law. Some tribes were left without federal recognition and are still fighting today for those rights. The resilience of Oregon's indigenous people is evident in their ongoing efforts to preserve and revitalize their languages, cultural practices, and traditional knowledge. Despite the many challenges posed by colonization, their culture persists and thrives today, thanks to the strength of their communities and the dedication of tribal leaders and members. And this is a picture of the Klamath Tribe's restoration celebration. I'm not sure what the date was on it, I couldn't find the date. So Oregon's indigenous tribes maintain a deep spiritual and cultural bond with the land, central to their identity and resilience. Tribal communities sustain their social structures, governance, and cultural practices through strong leadership and intergenerational knowledge. Language is vital to cultural identity. Oregon's indigenous languages were nearly lost due to assimilation processes and policies, including school bans against using those languages in schools. Tribes are now reviving their languages through revitalization programs. Indigenous tribes in Oregon maintain traditional ceremonies and rites of passage, including seasonal and spiritual celebrations that reflect their cultural identity. Practices like basket weaving and beadwork persist as methods of preserving heritage and storytelling. Tribes continue traditional gathering, hunting, and fishing in line with centuries-old ecological knowledge and cultural practices. Several tribes have created cultural centers and museums to preserve and share their history, traditions, and current issues. And many Oregon tribes have successfully reclaimed their lands through legal action and negotiation. Tribal governments and organizations still actively advocate for the protection of their rights, including religious practices, sacred sites, and natural resources. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Savannah to talk more about the laws. All right, let some of that sit and digest. Some of you probably have had some sort of or portion of that history before, and if you haven't, I encourage you to look further, not just on the internet, but in your local communities. Where are you from? Where do you call home? What ground do you step on every single day, and who was there 400 or 500 years before you? How did they respect the land? Food for thought. So, Jamie said a lot of terms in there that we understand and realize probably aren't well versed and universally understood terms, like recognition and sovereignty. So let's unpack a little bit of what those mean. So sovereignty, how many people understand what sovereignty is? Show of hands. Couple, okay. How many of those people understand what the difference between international sovereignty and tribal sovereignty is? Perfect. I love when we have educated persons in here. Thank you so much. So sovereignty in the terms of the indigenous sovereignty of Native American sovereignty, tribal sovereignty, is a little bit different than what most of us would hear as sovereignty as a sovereign nation, right? So when we think of an embassy in another country that has sovereignty in that nation, a little bit the same, very different. Tribes in the U.S. are actually considered domestic dependent nations. So while they do have sovereignty under U.S. framework, they don't have full autonomy as their own independent country, essentially. So, for example, a foreign country would have the ability, power, and authority to establish a military and do a lot of things that we obviously do not see indigenous nations doing. So they are not, as many people have the misconception of, they are not immune to every single law, and as soon as you step on tribal land, everything federal and in the US goes out the window. It doesn't really work like that. Tribal sovereignty is actually interframed in federal law. So there are certain federal laws and legislations that do apply on tribal land, but essentially it is a harmonious balance between the federal government and indigenous tribes, because obviously there is a very lengthy history of mistrust and disconnection between the federal government and Native Americans. And tribal sovereignty can actually be revoked or limited at any time by the federal government through legislation and the Supreme Court. However, I don't believe we're going to be seeing that anytime soon. Geographic isolation, however, through housing challenges on and off reservation lands in historically indigenous communities is an ongoing problem. Genocide has made it difficult for tribes to actually reclaim the land that was originally theirs, the land that they did hunt on, the land that they did fish on. They didn't get their land back. They got scraps. They got the unusable land. They got the land that no one wanted to farm, that no one wanted to develop, and that's why it was available. So it makes sense that it's probably not great land, and as a result, infrastructure, economic development, and agriculture are going to be adversely affected through many generations. And this is reflected through economic disparity. Many tribes struggle with clean water, which is vital for housing. Many tribes struggle with electricity, which is vital for housing. Additionally, this has also caused a lot of issues for developers, contractors, and infrastructure, because as we know, developing takes money, and money may literally grow from trees, but it does not grow on trees. And this has led to higher housing production costs and other barriers in tribal housing. Another key term with all the recognition discussion on the Recognition Act and the Termination Act is federal recognition. And this is an extremely important term because federal recognition is the government's ability to say, I deem you a legitimate indigenous tribe, regardless of what you think. I'm going to have the power to determine if you are eligible for benefits, for services, for economic assistance, for housing, for infrastructure. You have to have that recognition. If you don't, you're on your own. It allows the tribe to have their legal sovereignty. It allows them to govern themselves legally, politically, culturally, and economically. It also gives them access to resources and federal funding, eligibility to receive benefits through the federal government, which includes financial assistance, healthcare, housing, education, social services, and many more in a very, very long list. And without recognition, Indigenous people do not have access to any benefits as a Native American. they're given the exact same consideration as any member of the general public, except for the fact that they have a long-standing history of systemic genocidal impact. Some of those benefits the federal recognition does actually give is access to benefits that come through capital funding. And that can include programs like social services. It also includes emergency assistance, educational scholarships, and additional private funding, aside from the federal government, that only recognize federally recognized enrolled Natives. And that identification and the legitimacy of that Native status is also through identification cards. So federally recognized tribes are able to produce identification cards, generally that have an enrollment number or a form of identification that identifies that individual as an enrolled member of that tribe. If you're not enrolled, you cannot partake in those benefits, and federal recognition cannot be emphasized enough of how important that is. But it's also extremely difficult. So many tribes that didn't fall under past legislation within the last 30 to 40 years that did recognize them had to seek that recognition on their own. And that was extremely difficult, and still is. There are dozens and dozens. There's a list of tribes that have been seeking federal recognition for decades. And unfortunately, it's a lengthy process, and it takes decades or longer. The BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, oversees the recognition process, and generally tribes have to gather evidence through documentation. They have the burden of proof to show that they should be recognized. And it's a huge challenge for many tribes, because when your records are destroyed, disrupted by colonization, relocation, assimilation, it's really hard to produce that documentation. Many tribes spend decades collecting that evidence through documentation anywhere they can. That can look like talking through different families, different lineages. Hey, what do you have? What does your grandfather have in his old filing cabinet in the basement that might somehow piece these things together to prove that we have the right to these benefits, that we had this land that was taken from us? And unfortunately, the cost to gather those documents and resources, just to navigate the bureaucratic process of the BIA, and I don't know if anybody knows anything about the BIA, but as far as government agencies goes, length of time, it's probably one of the worst. So when you're economically disadvantaged, trying to navigate that process is extremely difficult. My tribe actually became federally recognized in 2001. February 14th, 2001, Valentine's Day, very easy day to remember. And I remember when I was a kid, before we were recognized, I was 9 when we were recognized. And a little bit before that, my family was so excited. We knew it was happening. We had tribal members that were going to the White House. We had people that had been gathering documents for decades. My mom, my aunt, my relatives, my grandfather, going to meetings, meeting in secret sometimes, because they didn't want people to know what they were doing, or they didn't want people knowing what they were doing in terms of, hey, we're trying to establish ourselves. Because, as you can see, I'm very, very pale-skinned. I am very white. I follow my French-Canadian ancestry very proudly, and I love my Indigenous side as well. Unfortunately, there was a lot of barriers, and still are for many tribes, who are not physically and visually what people expect an Indigenous person to look like. And there's a lot of racist bias and tension in that exact sector. Well, are you sure you're Native? Are you sure? What are you, 1/16th? 2%? It's very disheartening. So oftentimes there is also a lot of shame that is brought upon the process until you are able to reach recognition and have that ability to say, you know what, we got it, we did it. And as most of you know, there is a lovely casino just up I-5. We're worked for many years and had many families that put in money to put that land in trust and do that. And it is a very unique process to the Indigenous community, but without federal recognition, it is impossible to do that. So, who is a tribal member? So enrollment is that process that I mentioned. It's actually a process by which individual natives are officially categorized as members of the tribe. So being an enrolled member is a significant status in terms of benefits or no benefits. And it provides a feeling of legitimacy for many members of the Indigenous community and pride to be enrolled, to have an ID card, to be able to go to the clinic and not have to worry about, can I afford this? Can I afford to go to the doctor? Can I afford to get my child's crown filled, or to get something, some service, some ability that we can't afford, but now we can because we are recognized. So the status generally grants access to those rights and benefits, and tribes determine their own criteria for enrollment. So there are a lot of methods that tribes can determine for enrollment, right? They can say, lineal descent, was your mother enrolled? Was your father enrolled? Was your grandfather enrolled? Essentially, it just goes by, if they are enrolled, here's your family tree, fill out paperwork, verify your status, and then you will become enrolled. There's also something known as blood quantum. And blood quantum is generally a term meaning that person must have a certain percentage, a quantifiable percentage of tribal ancestry to be eligible for membership, enrollment. Some tribes have residency requirements where some people have to establish that they were there, certain lineage requirements beyond just ancestry. And there's also other tribal-specific criteria. Some tribes require dual criteria. Some require this and this. So it's just a matter of how that tribe frames their enrollment process. Blood quantum, however, is historically a very problematic process. So it was originally used in the 18th century, way back when settlers actually used it to limit the rights of natives above a certain percentage, to encourage Native Americans to breed out their identity. Are you half Native? Are you half Native, half white? There are a lot of laws and legislation for land use, for who can own land. In Oregon, there were deeds, and there actually still are some deeds to this day that have wording that says this land may only be owned by a white man or a half-white Native, because the half-white was their legitimacy. And unfortunately, it continued to be a problem. It was weaponized in the 19th and 20th century to limit certain benefits to natives after over a century of integration. So it was used as a weapon in the forefront, and it was used as a weapon consequentially centuries later. The government used the system to exclude larger populations of Native communities, and many tribes adopted the blood quantum rule for their enrollment requirements when they were being federally recognized in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It perpetuates further racism amongst tribal members and even families. Sometimes, if a sibling had a different parent, they both had a mother from that tribe, one had a father from that tribe, one had a father who was white. One sibling is enrolled, one is not. One sibling has health care, one does not. It still happens to this day. And unfortunately, it also creates feelings of resentment within families and tribal communities if someone isn't Indian enough. And the model of blood quantum is systemic colonization. There is really no other way to define it. It was created by colonial settlers for exclusionary purposes, weaponized for exclusionary purposes, and is still used for exclusionary purposes. It undermines the ability of tribes also to maintain long-term ancestral survival. Membership shrinks with each generation as less people are actually eligible to meet blood quantum requirements. Here in the corner here, we have a Might be a little bit hard to see, but essentially, top left, you have parents, and it goes all the way down in fractions, measuring each generation, each fraction, each percentage getting smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually they don't meet the requirements anymore. Membership dwindles. Culture dwindles. Infighting occurs. When we are against our own people, we are not fighting the real problem. Many tribes today, a very large majority, have adjusted their enrollment policies to exclude blood quantum requirements. Some still have it. They have their own reasons for it. Some want very specific requirements, such as blood quantum of just any native tribe. Maybe it's not their tribe, maybe it's any tribe. There are a lot of intertribal relationships and dynamics amongst other tribes, and so that ultimately affects the process of each individual tribe. And they can change it at any time. They can ratify their own rules, they can ratify their own enrollment requirements to open the gates. My tribe has what we call lost birds. There are people who were not able to enroll because we have a very short enrollment window. From the day someone turns 18, if they're not enrolled, they have 1 year to enroll. When they turn 19, that's it. So if their parent wasn't involved, if their grandmother was sent to a boarding school or adopted out of the tribe and does not know her lineage, and they don't find out until they're 25, they're out. If someone's parent didn't want to do the paperwork, or they forgot, or someone dropped the ball in any way, shape, or form, that person is now gone. They're still Cowlitz, but they can't get an ID card. They can't get health care. They can't go to our clinics. They can't participate in our cultural programs where they can sign up for receiving kits to do cedar weaving and to do beading and to get reintegrated with our culture because they're not enrolled. It's extremely exclusionary. And there are a lot of other barriers. Statistics, let's just do some basic statistics, numbers, to paint a picture of some of the current barriers in Indigenous communities. Native Americans have some of the worst economic conditions for housing in the entire country, paired with severe economic needs for housing. According to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, 1/3 of Native households live in poverty. 1/3 across the board. That is the highest rate of poverty of any ethnic group in the United States. It is over twice the US poverty rate. And the Indigenous population is very small. So 1/3 of that population, there you go, systemic economic disparity. And when you move into the plains regions, into the Midwest, the poverty rate goes up to 40%. Economic disparity. Natives living on reservations have an employment rate of 50%, unemployment rate of 50%, due to lack of economic opportunities and lack of development on or near reservations. In a desert, you cannot create water. Natives on reservation also face a significant overcrowding due to factors like lack of available housing, lack of affordable housing, and cultural tendencies for families to live and stay together. Multi-generational living was a way of life. Families are more likely to double up, which means entire families living together in the same household. 2 families, their children, same household. I have family who doubles up. I have cousins, their wife, their husband, they have 4 kids. Their wife, their husband, they have 2 kids. And we live on the same property, same land, they share resources, they communally live, they love it. But it is not what they truly want to do. They would love to have their own space, have a room for each of their children, but that's not necessarily a possibility for their future. And development and building costs are now higher than ever. So especially in rural and underserved areas, tribes lacking the infrastructure on or around the available land, now it's not developed. And it continues to be a desert because you cannot create water in the desert. You have to bring water to the desert. And unfortunately, this perspective is key to understanding why off-reservation housing is so important. And that is what we're going to talk about. But first, what is a reservation? I'm sure we've all heard the term reservation, but what is it? Trust land. A reservation is trust land. So what that means is the land is held in trust by the federal government and essentially given to the indigenous tribe to govern as they see fit. That's what we know as reservation land. Tribes can establish their own governments, laws, and regulations, including zoning and building codes. They can establish their own court system on reservation land, on trust land. And then we have non-trust land, which is also referred to as fee simple land. Now, it's a very simple way of saying it's literally treated like all the rest of the land. Federal, state, local rules and guidelines apply. You can own it like private property, but as a tribe, that entity still cannot govern that land. It cannot govern non-trust land. It can govern on trust land, but it cannot govern on non-trust land. That is that sovereign agreement with the U.S. framed under U.S. constitutional rule. And fortunately, fair housing law and many other laws and regulations do not apply on trust land reservations. So we at the Fair Housing Council are never going to take a fair housing case that applies on reservation land. That is generally going to be decided by the tribe, by their system. However, it is completely possible that the tribe may ask for resources or information or advice from external entities, and it does happen. A lot of tribes don't have the ability to run a full court system, a full judicial system, a full civil or criminal court system. So oftentimes they will outsource to the local county, the local state, or federal government. That's very common. As well as there's also some exception to that rule. So there are federal guidelines that actually regulate if serious crimes of specific natures happen on tribal land, they're automatically going to be outsourced and held in federal jurisdiction. And that can include murder, arson, assault with intent to kill, and there's a list of crimes. But essentially, tribes can't just say, well, he murdered him, but we like him, so he's cool, we're just gonna let him go. It does not work like that. They still have to follow federal law. They can't just get away with anything. So tribal housing is actually ran by generally what's called a tribal designated housing entity, or TDHE, sometimes also external property management. Generally, this does not happen on reservation land. I've never seen a case where a property management company comes in on reservation land and runs housing. That's generally done by the tribal housing authority or housing department. And every federally recognized tribe, apologies, I just skipped a little bit. Every federally recognized tribe designates it an entity to administer the housing programs, and generally those are going to be funded through a large variety of sources, depending on the tribe's size, infrastructure, and economic need, and we'll get into that a little bit. What is tribal housing needs? So tribes actually have inherent right to define their own housing needs and priorities. Each tribe has uniquely independent needs that are based on a variety of factors, and that's going to include economic needs, circumstances, cultural needs, cultural unique needs or desires of that tribe. For example, tribes living in the Pacific Northwest tend to have different cultural practices and desires, including living preferences, than Midwest and Plains tribes. Tribes in the Pacific Northwest lived in longhouses or plank houses. There's a little picture there. So a longhouse or plank house is a communal living, multi-generational living. It's generally a very, very large building, very open, and many members of the same families or communities all shared the same living space. Many PNW tribes actually lived in specific homes that were made of cedar. So cedar was used for a plethora of things. It was used for not only structural building, but the bark of cedar was stripped. There is a ceremony that many tribes, ours included, do where they strip cedar bark. Stripping the bark from cedar does not kill the tree, it does not cut down the tree, but instead allows the tree to grow new bark, and it is a replenishing resource that was used for things like weaving baskets, weaving bed pads. Cedar was used to make boards that mothers would use to carry the infants on their back when they were foraging or fishing or doing all sorts of activities. And it was also used for medicinal purposes, for ceremonial regalia, for traditional wear, and it still is used today. I am almost done completing my first cedar hat. It was very difficult because cedar is wood, so you have to spend a lot of time soaking it and kind of understanding how to weave. And it is not simple, but it is a very, very healing practice spiritually. But unfortunately, cedar is not exactly the cheapest wood out there. And so using it as a building material can be a barrier because it's not necessarily affordable, and it can lead to higher cost, higher use, and higher development costs. Tribes also practice different populations, prioritize different populations for housing needs. Elders are prioritized generally as a first priority. Veterans are also very generally highly prioritized. We call them warriors. And also, those priorities may not line up with what that tribe wants to do on off-reservation housing, because maybe they want to buy an apartment complex and they want to let all the leases run up and then move all their tribal members in. There's a lot of reasons and regulations why they can't do that. They can't just say, well, we're just going to make this all for our tribal members. And we're just going to buy this with our casino revenue, and we're going to have our people living here, and we're going to run it the way we want, and we're going to do what we want, what we would normally do on reservation. Can't do that. There are regulations and laws that will conflict with that, like the Fair Housing Act. But how does the Fair Housing Act apply? We'll figure that out. But where's the money? Money comes from a lot of different sources. For the purpose of this presentation, we're talking about off-reservation housing. This is not an all-inclusive list of funding. As we know, funding comes from all sorts of places, but we're going to kind of cover the big ones. So there's non-government or private loans. Those can come from banks, credit unions, different private entities, and also other tribes. That is how the Cowlitz Casino was actually originally funded. We had a loan from a different tribe, the Mohegan tribe. They helped us. They helped design, build, and facilitate and manage the casino. They helped get us off the ground. So it wasn't even a bank. It wasn't a credit union because they wouldn't loan to the tribe. They didn't want to. So we had to look elsewhere. There's also the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, or the NAHASDA, and it is the single largest tribal housing, Indian housing fund in existence. And generally, the Indian Housing Block Grant, or the Indian Community Development Block Grant, is going to be the #1 funding source for tribal housing programs. And there's also a Title VI Loan Guarantee Program, which works very similarly to CDBG funds, but just under different application. There's also tribal revenue. The tribes use their own money. There's low-income tax credit housing. It can also be utilized grant funding and other federal and state programs. Tribes have some unique income sources, so they've got revenue. This can come from Indian gaming, casinos, as we all know. It can come from tax revenue from the sales of goods, and it can also be used for distribution of revenue to the tribal members themselves. The distribution is determined by the tribal government. They determine how much funding is used, how it is distributed, who gets it, at what age do they get it? Maybe this age gets a certain amount, under 18 gets a certain amount, above this much. They determine everything, and they can do whatever they think is the right thing to do. And there's also a new funding that actually, a new type of fund called General Welfare Exclusion, or GWE. This was passed in 2014 under the General Welfare Exclusion Act and is very unique because it is a completely tax-exempt benefit. It is not an income. It is not taxable. It is essentially exempt from consideration for other social service programs, for generally anything that has income-based qualification. And GWE is, again, very new, and many tribes are still trying to figure out how it works because there are guidelines under GWE. It has to be distributed for welfare of the general population. It cannot be lavish. It cannot be grand. What does that look like? What is lavish? I mean, some people pay $20,000 a year in daycare. So if they got $20,000, would that be lavish? The NHASDA, the Indian Housing Block Grant, that lovely, lovely Indian Housing Fund, is the largest source for Indian housing, can be used for off-reservation. And Indian Housing Block Grant, IHBG, used for off-reservation housing is actually very new. Generally, within the last 5 to 7 years, there's applications of the funding being used for off-reservation housing. But prior to that, 20, 30 years ago, these funds were not used for off-reservation housing. It was not an option. And there's also the Title VI loan guarantee, which essentially works the same way as a loan against CDBG, meaning, hey, we know we're going to get $500,000 for the next 5 years, but can we instead have $2.5 million up front so we can build more units? They can leverage that, and then they pay the funds back in a fund agreement. In 2024, May 2024, the Biden administration awarded $1.1 billion to IHBG, the most funding Indian housing has ever gotten, ever, from any presidential administration. And it's also uniquely exempt from almost all provisions of fair housing. Meaning that if you use those IHBG funds, you can have preference policies. You can say, we're only going to have this housing for natives. You can do that. There are exceptions. So some other federally funded programs, we'll get into those exceptions in a minute. Section 184 Indian Loan Guarantee Program. There are a lot of loans that are essentially federally backed that work the same way as FHA loans. They are almost always going to be income dependent. They're almost always going to serve low income, generally between 50 to 80% AMI and below. There's also USDA funding, there's Indian-specific loans, there's rural housing programs, there's also utility assistance, and the U.S. Treasury actually created what's known as the Local Assistance Tribal Consistency Fund, or LATCF, which was developed as part of the 2021 American Rescue Plan Act, all those lovely COVID funds, and it was given $1 billion in funding. That funding was distributed depending on per capita, per size, per need to every tribe in the United States, and the tribes determined how they used it. Some used it for healthcare, some used it for simple rental assistance to get people through the pandemic. Some tribes used it to expand their healthcare on reservations. Some used it for emergency assistance, but it was generally very discretionary. So, apologize. Lovely little picture here. Go back one slide. So discrimination in tribal housing is kind of a unique aspect. So as we know, fair housing doesn't apply on tribal lands. However, there's housing off tribal lands. So what happens? In 2024, there was a tribal member of a federally recognized tribe in Oregon that applied for tribal housing and was actually denied. The tribal member said, I'm going to do reasonable accommodation. I want you to overlook my criminal history. And the tribe said no. The tribal member appealed to tribal council. Tribal council said no. However, it was low-income tax credit housing, off-reservation. So the tribal member contacted Fair Housing Council, and Fair Housing Council said, okay, let's look into it. And Fair Housing Council looked into it. A long story short, they got into housing. So there are absolutely circumstances where fair housing applies. A HUD complaint was made. The tribe was made aware of how they did not apply their policy equitably, how they did not follow their own policy. And that tribal member is in housing. This lovely building, does anybody recognize this? Has anybody seen this before? Yeah, in Portland. This is the Nasika Ilihi, 59-unit housing development in Portland that was actually built by CDP, Community Development Partners, through a partnership between CDP, Native American Youth and Family, or NAYA, and the Native American Rehabilitation Association Northwest, or NARA, and the Siletz tribe. The Siletz tribe utilized IHBG funds, and they combined it with some OHCS funding and some other funding and a little bit of other funding, and created this beautiful mixed funded building. But how does that work? Because IHBG, no fair housing. OHCS, fair housing. Well, what they did was they divided the funding by unit, and they apply policy per unit. Different housing per unit. Different preference policies per unit. 20 of the units are Siletz tribal member priority, and then any other federally recognized tribe priority, and then general public. Kind of awesome, gotta say. This is significant and historical because this was the first large housing complex using mixed funding, using IHBG funding, and it's running today. It's operating. It's beautiful. This is the courtyard. So the building was designed for multi-use housing, and it has a lot of community space. So 4% is actually LITCH or LITCH housing, low income tax credit housing, for 60% or less AMI. There's also mental health housing. There's general housing. So there is treatment housing, there are service programs, but they only operate per unit. Might be a little bit confusing to people who live there. But the development is unique, it's comprehensive, and it is a physical representation of a new direction using IHBG funds, using tribal housing funds for off-reservation housing in Portland. The Siletz tribe is not located in Portland, but the housing's in Portland. The uses are vast. But for fair housing, preference policies. IHBG funds can have preference policies. Other funds cannot have ethnic, racial, tribal, or any other specific preference policies because that is against fair housing. However, IHBG funds can have preference policies. And again, the Fair Housing Act is about equal treatment for all individuals, but under the NAHASDA, under IHBG, they understand that there is a certain amount of advancement needed in the Native communities to give that leg up because everything that they went through, there's no way to give that back. There's no way to undo it. There's no way to apologize for everything that has been done. And that's not what we need to do. We don't need to apologize. We need to advance. We need to assist tribal housing to advance. And since the framework of the NAHASDA allows for that creation of policies, and the IHBG allows for mixed funding, it allows for unit by unit funding, meaning you could pull funding from 10 different sources and have units that have multi-use. You can have recovery housing, you can have tribal housing, you can have medical housing. You can have so many different types of housing in the same building, in the same community, having members of different ethnic, racial, protected classes living together in communal harmony. And it's affordable. Where there's mixed funding, there's also mixed application of laws. So it's important that the people who are operating the property management, the community services, they also understand how the laws are going to apply. It's also important for the residents to understand how those laws are going to apply. Policies, procedures, and educational materials should make it clear what applies where. Lease agreements should reflect that. And the future of tribal funding and fair housing, well, the development of tribal housing using those funds is new, but with $1 billion, there's a lot that can be done. I believe the Nasika area, he used $17 million of IHBG funds. And that, again, also included much of the initial construction and the design element and the cultural elements that went into that. It's possible that, like the Nasika area, we can see a lot more housing, more units, more affordable units. And again, unit by unit. I mean, if a developer has to say, hey, you know what, let's use 30 million of this, 30 million of this, 30 million of this, what do we need to do? There's a need for housing. There's also a need for education and for collaboration between designers, developers, tribes, everybody in the housing community, to keep in mind that we need to work from a trauma-informed and educated approach, uniquely trauma-informed, indigenous trauma-informed. There's also the consideration of policy and law. Things are going to change. Laws are going to change. Application of laws are going to change. So also understanding that as we go on and as we evolve, the law will follow, case law will follow, and the landscape of housing will change, it will expand, and I'm really hoping that my tribe will work with some of you in the future. I've made some great connections at this conference today and yesterday, and I really hope that everybody else has as well, and that we'll see a pretty great future with tribal funding and housing. Thank you. Do we have questions? Yes. We're going to have a mic runner, so if you have questions, we'll bring the mic to you.
I have a couple questions. My first question is, what about checkerboard reservations where you have both fee simple and trust land in the reservation? If you were to build affordable housing using IHBG, would you then be not subject to the fair housing laws, or would you be able to have tribal preference, or are you still subject to fair housing?
If you're using exclusively IHBG funds, you would absolutely be able to have preference policies. Now, I'm going to add a caveat. So, the one exemption, exception, whatever you want to call it, absolutely, one thing is protected, and that's going to be disability. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and all provisions therein, including reasonable accommodations, reasonable modifications, and all accommodations for any disability are included and are required under the NAHASDA. So there are currently circumstances where, yes, there can be a preference policy for natives. And the thing is the NAHASDA is framed to benefit indigenous populations. So you can absolutely have a preference policy using those funds to say, yes, we're going to, tribal preference policy. We're going to prioritize elders first. How does that tribe define an elder? Maybe it's 65 and up, maybe it's 60 and up. They're going to get first priority, then veterans, then disability. So we're starting to see where it's application of they want to apply preferences, which is fine. However, disability still gets equal preference and priority. So it's something where there are things that are currently being brought to HUD, brought to ONAP, where there are these intersections that are happening, But because there is not case law, there is not precedent of how this is going to be treated, we're still kind of figuring that out. So we're going to kind of, we have to wait to a certain extent to see. Obviously, it's like any new legislation. It's enacted. It has that benefit behind it, has that good, we're going to do this, it's going to work, it's going to be great. But as we all know, there are going to be circumstances and cases where it is not going to work out well, or there are going to be intersections, and once those are handled, we'll understand it better. With IHBG funds, Indian-based, indigenous-based, tribal-based preference policies, absolutely, but it can't be exclusionary on disability. So fair housing in that circumstance would not apply to preference policies to race, ethnicity. However, it would apply to disability on fee simple land, not on reservation land.
But if you have fee simple land that's in the reservation, how is that treated? Is that where there's no case law right now?
There isn't, and
Okay.
it's part of when you have integrated land, so inter-integrated land, right? Part of the problem is if you have, well, this part of it right here in this building are fee simple, but then this half of this building is, sovereign lands, trust land. That's gonna be a jurisdictional issue for, okay, well, there haven't been any issues yet, but when there are, that is when ONAP and HUD are going to get involved, and it's gonna be essentially it's gonna be a jurisdictional matter for them to figure out. And I will say that there is one case that I know of that is currently going up the chain, and it actually is regarding disability. And it's going to be really interesting because it's going to be also a matter of if a tribe has the sovereign ability to say, okay, we're going to apply our programs this way, but our program is funded by both tribal revenue, IHBG revenue. How is that going to work? How do we get down to the dollar amount of how much of those dollars came from which funding source? And I think that there's going to be a lot of ongoing weaving and unweaving of the law in that sense.
And so that's what brings me to the second question, which is if you have your NAHASDA funds in a project, but you also leverage that with other funds, like OHCS funds or tax credits or whatever, do you automatically lose that preference that you can have?
No, so the way essentially, so the Nisika Ilihi, right, it's in Portland. So the way that they did the project, and this is with many of those funds, so when you apply for those funds, they're going to ask for your design, they're going to ask for your development process, and they're going to want paperwork that says, okay, this is where the funding is going. 1 million is going here, 2 million is going here. The way Nisika Ilihi did it, they broke it down with the intent, and now the implementation, with the intent of saying 20 of these units are going to be exclusionarily preference for tribal members. So 20 of those are IHBG units. 17 of them are OHCS units for low income under 60% AMI. Another 8 of them are treatment and recovery housing, and they actually have their own individual services that go in, and they have it broken down by unit, which is why it's very, very important, especially for service providers, property managers, to understand and have an integration of each lease agreement. How is the lease going to be written out? How is the application going to be written out? And making sure that they're specific per unit. And that's something that's why the Nisika Ilihi is so unique and so innovative, is they figured out a way to do that so far, where it is working, where it is, they figured out how to apply. They figured out that, NARA goes in and they provide services to the other units. But that doesn't mean that they can't provide services to the IHBG units. But they have the requirements that are lined out that were in line with that funding. So it's really a very broadly integrated process of saying, really, I would love to see the documentation behind it. I'm really interested to know how many pages their development plan was and their implementation. Oh my gosh, thank God for AI, right? But just understanding, even from a legal standpoint as well, how it's framed within federal regulation, what it applies to, and it's really amazing to see how it worked out as far as how they partnered, how OHCS partnered. I mean, 4% is a very specific amount of low-income tax credit housing funds. And so it's like, okay, this unit here, that one's this, and 8 units of this. And that is something that I've had a lot of good conversations the last couple days at this conference, and there are some developers that are working with tribes currently, leveraging IHBG funds, and they are running into questions as they go. Hey, we have to do this, but it's under this code, but like if it's this funding, and it's taking a while, and they're kind of tripping and stepping in the process. But they're learning, and the developers are learning, and they're learning more about law, and the tribes are, kind of helping navigate that process. And tribes can be very difficult to communicate with. I understand that very, very well. And so it's why I really love looking at the future and the innovation of what's going on, because we're kind of watching it happen. We're watching it happen, and there are probably going to be issues along the way that we're also going to watch happen. We're watching history, and I think that's why this is so groundbreaking and significant, but it's really going to be a wait and see thing, because, there can still be rules and policies, and people can still violate them, but it's a matter of, having that person that comes forward and says, you know what, I'm disabled and I was discriminated against, and yeah, this might be IHBG funds, but you can't discriminate against me. And, making sure that, we at the Fair Housing Council and other states and other organizations understand how to help them navigate that process, and making sure that we are, not urging, that's a bad word, but encouraging them to push forward, to say, you know what, it may not have been done yet, this may not have been done yet, this complaint may not have been made yet, but you might be the one that's going to help shape the future and how legislation is actually going to be implemented. So unfortunately, I don't have a specific answer, but it's a wait and see.
We have about 5 minutes. Would you like to take one more question?
Yeah.
Okay. What else is there in the audience?
There's something out there. It can be fair housing related. I'm going to assume by the silence that everybody thought that was an okay presentation. And thank you guys so much for being here. I know it's the afternoon on Wednesday. I have to leave here and drive to Newport, so I know that some people here are really pushing their time limits, but thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to actually put this back to our OG slide with Jamie and Mike's contact information. Please feel free to take down our emails. Please contact us. Contact us if you don't think it's a fair housing, maybe you think it might be a fair housing question, or you're like, you know what, this question is so small, so minuscule, I don't really want to bug us. Bug us. I love waking up to emails in my inbox. It's like, it makes my day. I have to get my toddler ready to get dressed and go to daycare, and I'm like, yeah, I've got work to do. Seriously. Bug us.
Also, please feel free to fill out the evaluations on your table, specifically the ones for the Fair Housing Council. We really do take your feedback seriously. So if you have any questions or you would like to follow up, please fill that out.
Yes, this is our first time ever doing this presentation. This is kind of landmark. I spent many weeks doing a lot of research and trying to figure out what to include in this presentation, what not to include, not to run it to be 2 hours. So please fill out those evaluations. I really want to know genuine feedback. How is my talking? How is my speaking? Am I using my hands too much? I do that sometimes. Please, we really, really appreciate it. And thank you so much to Housing Oregon for letting us do this presentation today and record it, and hopefully we can expand on this a little bit in the future.
Absolutely.
Thank you all.
I want to be the second person to say, I learned